In this video, we will have a look at different types of knowledge. When we think of knowledge, we think in first instance of the kind of knowledge that we use in our ordinary lives to manage our affairs. It is the kind of thing that Google collects and makes available. It is the kind of knowledge that science has perfected to an amazing degree in the physical domain. But science is not as good in the area of psychology, let alone in the area of spirituality, as it is in the area of physics. So something is missing in our modern civilization. But somehow, most people, even now, believe that there is something divine, something beyond this kind of ordinary life that we live. The vast majority of humanity still describes itself either as religious or as spiritual, because we have somewhere some inner faith, in some people and knowledge, of something that goes beyond the physical appearances that our culture as a whole is so obsessed with. This division between an outer knowledge of the physical reality and the social reality and an inner knowledge of the one, of the divine, is not new. It is mentioned in one of the older Indian scriptures, the Isha Upanishad. But interestingly, the Isha Upanishad values it very differently than we do in modern times. And it addresses itself to people who had a very different idea about what is important and what is not than we have now. The Isha Upanishad says there are two types of knowledge, vidya and avidya. Vidya is knowledge. Avidya is generally translated as ignorance, but it is actually the knowledge of the many, while vidya is the knowledge of the one. The Isha Upanishad says, if you don't have that knowledge of the one, of the divine, then you live obviously in great darkness. And then it says, but if you don't have knowledge of the many, you live in what is perhaps an even greater darkness. And then it says that you need both. Now, clearly this assumes that the people who came to listen to the Isha Upanishad had only an interest in the knowledge of the one. A modern scholar would address his audience very differently. A physics teacher might tell his students, yes, you must learn physics. That's what you're here for. But you should not forget to also know the divine. He may not dare to say so in a modern situation, but he would take the knowledge of the many as an obvious necessity, and he would have to, if he's brave enough, mention that the knowledge of the divine is also important. The Isha Upanishad did the opposite. It was meant for people who took the knowledge of the divine for granted as the one most essential thing that humans need. And it brought as a kind of warning that you should also pay attention to the world. Now in modern times, we do want both. We have become very enthusiastic about the physical outer world, but we also would like to have a better knowledge of the divine. And we will see that it is not sufficient to combine the spiritual understanding of the Indian tradition as it is at present with the knowledge of science. We have to develop something that goes beyond both, which is kind of indicated in the oldest Indian scriptures, in the Rig Veda, but it seems to have been forgotten, or at least people did not believe anymore that it was possible to pursue it. So we'll have a look at that. But that is clearly not very simple to achieve. So we have to start with the ordinary types of knowledge that we have in our ordinary waking consciousness. Sri Aurobindo distinguishes in one of the chapters of the Life Divine 4 types of knowledge that all occur in our ordinary waking consciousness. The first one he calls knowledge by identity. And for him, this is the most important type of knowledge. But most of us have not developed this at all. So the only thing that remains of it in our ordinary waking consciousness is just a basic sense that we are there, that we are real, that our life is serious, that we are there. That's all. Everything else we know about ourselves is actually filled in by the other types of knowledge. Of ourselves, of who we really are in our deepest essence, in ordinary life, hardly anyone has any idea. We'll get to it later, how to develop it. The second one is knowledge by intimate, direct contact. That's quite a mouthful. But it means that it is a kind of knowledge that you have of things that you identify with, that you are really close to, like your own thoughts, like your own feelings, your sensations, your body. You know them by identifying with them. You cannot describe them objectively. That's not part of this kind of knowledge. The active side of this kind of knowledge is skill. It is there in dance, in athletics. And it's used in skill training, also attitudes and so on. But science doesn't do much with it because it's not explicit. And it's definitely not objective. The third one is knowledge by separative direct contact. It is separative because in this kind of knowledge you look at yourself. It is commonly more known as introspection. In our ordinary waking consciousness, we look with one part of the mind at the rest of the mind. It is notoriously unreliable. The last one is separative knowledge by indirect contact. Again, a mouthful. Sri Aurobindo calls it separative because we consider the world other than ourselves. So there is ourselves, then there is knowledge, then there is the thing known, the object, and all three are separate. Interestingly, he calls it indirect because it needs the senses. Most people would call knowledge that we get through our senses, something you see, something you hear, direct knowledge. They would say, yeah, I know it, I have seen it. Yeah? But for Sri Aurobindo, this seeing with the eyes is indirect because it is dependent on the senses and it is constructed. So in some ways, it is second-hand. And he considers only knowledge that comes direct, ready-made by intuition through knowledge. It is a very different perspective than most people have nowadays. Science has developed this last type, the separative knowledge by indirect contact, the sense-based knowledge of the outer world, to an astounding effect. To quite an extent with the help of mathematics, which is actually intuitive. It is a kind of very rigorous way of dealing with essentially intuitive knowledge. Mathematics is not based itself on the senses. It comes from inside. It is then checked with outer experiment and all that, but by itself it is not. So science has worked out very well some kind of intuitive knowledge, a very limited form of it, but still a form of it, in the form of mathematics, with a very rigorous way of dealing with sense-based knowledge. But so far, that approach has not worked very well for the human sciences, for everything that has to do with consciousness, experience, our own being, values, love, care, commitment, intent, responsibility. All those things that are very important to us, but that are by themselves, by no stretch of imagination, physical. They exist only in our consciousness. All right. Now, all these four types can be perfected. One could argue that science has already perfected the last one, the separative knowledge by indirect contact. So we'll start with that one because we know it the best. That's really the kind of knowledge that our culture, our global civilization has specialized in. So knowledge by separative indirect contact starts very simply as the kind of sense that we make of the world around us, which is quite error-prone, but still works to some extent. And science has developed it fabulously. From, again, going slowly from the outside inside, as our culture demands, this third one in the line is knowledge by separative direct contact. Separative because we look at ourselves as if we look objectively at ourselves, and it is still direct because we don't need the senses for it. It is known as introspection, and you look with one part of yourself at another part, and because of that it is unreliable. It is something like a judge presiding over a case in which his own family is involved. You cannot expect that judge to be impartial. And we are not good at introspection. Yeah, to give one very typical classical example, someone who is very industrious and really works very hard is quite likely inclined to call himself lazy because he feels he should work still harder than he does. While someone who is really not good for anything and does very, very little may still think that he does quite a bit compared to what he would like to do. And there are millions of other examples which show that basically we are not good at introspection. So it is very well understandable why psychology in the beginning of last century gave up on it. What they didn't know was that the Indian tradition has found an excellent way of making introspection reliable. Science works to some extent because we look with the mind at the physical world. And there's a big gap between the two. The physical world does not normally, except maybe in some very special cases, immediately get affected by the mind. When you look at, try to study your own mind in psychology, it's very different because the mind will be immediately influenced by any other activity in the mind. So you cannot really study it and leave it alone. But it is possible for us as human beings to go deep inside and find what is called the Sakshi, the witness consciousness. If you have managed to silence the mind, to purify, clean up your vital nature sufficiently so that they don't interfere anymore, then you can kind of jump from that very quiet and silent mind to the pure consciousness that actually holds our thinking. Strange enough, when you remove the activities of the mind, the activities of the heart, the feelings, the sensations, the thoughts, from your consciousness, consciousness doesn't disappear. It is not some small adjunct to these mental activities. On the contrary, when you remove these activities, these identifications of the consciousness from the consciousness, consciousness gets more clear, way more full of delight, and it can watch absolutely objectively whatever happens inside of it. So if you reach that inner pure consciousness, you have sufficient distance to watch whatever happens in your mind, in your heart, in your body, objectively, without affecting it, precisely as it is. This is a very strange situation. It is radically different from introspection. There's no comment, there's no judgment, there's no care whether it is your thoughts or someone else's. It's very pure. So this is probably the most important tool that a new consciousness-centered psychology should use, the witness consciousness. And it's doable. It's not easy, but then physics also is not easy. Not all people can understand mathematics well. So not everybody needs to specialize in doing this, but it is humanly possible and fascinating. So that was the third one from Sri Aurobindo's perspective. The second one is in a way even more interesting. Normally it is just our awareness of our identification with our own thoughts, feelings, and so on. Yeah? So it is not much good. You fully become your anger, you become your happiness. It comes, goes, very fickle. If you go deeper in it and you begin to see the depths of your own nature, you realize that what we know on the surface, our own feelings, thoughts and all, is very, very superficial. And that there is way more insight than most people know. One of the fascinating things is that not only you can understand much more of yourself if you have that witness consciousness and if you have that inner clarity, but that deep inside we are all connected. And anyone who has had a guru at some stage worth his salt will know that you have people who can really read other people's thoughts and feelings and everything. In some ways better than these people do themselves. We are inside very closely connected. And it is just for practical reasons that we close that off, because we would not be able to handle all that. The other thing is that there are whole worlds of thoughts, of beauty, of happiness, of love inside that people on the surface have no clue about. And it is those beautiful worlds that actually have slowly manifested in the actual outside world that we know. But if you know that inner reality behind that outer nature, you see a world that is way more beautiful than what you can see on the surface. That gets even one step further with this ultimate knowledge by identity. While on the surface it's hardly anything, just a kind of knowledge that you exist, that the world is real, that other people are real. It is possible to find out who you are in your real essence behind or underneath your personality. Your personality is largely a product of genetics, early education, upbringing, your culture, your parents, all kinds of influences. It's a construct. It's part of the outer world. In some people, it has also an influence that comes from the soul, from inside. But if you develop this inner knowledge, you can find out what that soul actually is and who you actually are underneath that surface personality that is built by nature, with a bit of good luck under influence of your soul. It depends how far you have developed, how far your soul has emancipated. Sri Aurobindo says that if you develop this inner knowledge that can lead to an understanding of the essence of your own soul, you can go one step higher and you can reach a point where you can know actually everything from the inside out. And Sri Aurobindo asserts that all the functions of the ordinary mind, all the sense-based knowledge and so on, you can also know by going inside and knowing it not from outside in but from inside out. And we know from Sri Aurobindo's diaries that he was not in the habit of making claims that he had not tested. So he did not get this idea out of old scriptures. He recognized some hints of it in the oldest Indian scripture, the Rig Veda. But he found it by exploration inside. And it's quite far from where we are. But according to Sri Aurobindo, it is the next step in our collective evolution. So it should be possible to develop it more and more, to know things directly by intuition. And as it is, this knowledge by identity, this essential knowledge that has created the world, is part of our own structure. It is probably an essential ingredient for us to build even our knowledge of the outer world. We have already hinted at the fact that to develop science, science needs mathematics, which is somehow the language that describes physical movements. It may not describe psychological movements very well. At least we haven't found a mathematics that does that. So, to some extent, this inner knowledge is a kind of secret knowledge that we already use to build our understanding of the world. Because what the senses offer us is probably too little to build as beautiful an image of reality as we do. If you develop it, and in many people it comes once in a while spontaneously, but you can develop it more and more. This inner knowledge, this ready-made intuition, can come also to us directly. And Sri Aurobindo distinguishes three forms of it. Intuition, which is a kind of deep, intrinsic, true understanding of how something operates, what something is. Inspiration, where that knowledge is coming to you in the form of words, in the form of language. It can come fully ready-made, that you know the exact text. It can also come in a way that still requires expression, but once the expression has been formed in your mind, which has learned a certain language, the outcome is kind of inevitable. It could not have been better. It's a perfect expression of some inner knowledge. And the third form of that inner knowledge that Sri Aurobindo describes is revelation, where you see an image of the truth. And beyond that, these three modes, there is the real intuition by itself, the individualized knowledge of the details of how the world operates. Beyond that, there is a cosmic world of understanding. And beyond that, there is still another kind of knowledge, which is the knowledge that Sri Aurobindo says we may reach in the next step of our evolution. Actually, Sri Aurobindo does not say we may reach. Sri Aurobindo is quite convinced that that is the next step of the evolution, and that it is simply destined and logical that that's where we go to. Because if you see from where we come, then we are clearly half-baked with the kind of knowledge and understanding that we have. And there is a higher knowledge, there must be a higher knowledge, to create the incredible harmony and beauty of the world as it even is, as it is now. It could never have been created by anything like the mind or our human imagination. It goes way beyond that. And to develop that in detail is, of course, a very complex process, and God knows how long it will take. But we can already do one thing, and that is as often as we can during the day, and as complete as we can, open ourselves to that higher knowledge, to that power of harmony, that love, that ultimately is creating, is manifesting this world. And we are part of it. So, in a way, we have just to open ourselves to what we already are in our very deepest essence, and allow that to penetrate our outer nature and every aspect of what we are. So that's the long-term prospect. And the other types of knowledge are all hints in this direction.